Welcome to the lecture entitled, How Could Consensual Sex Be Harmful? I'm Andrew Chapman. In this lecture, we'll discuss 7 topics. 1. Consensual sex can nonetheless be harmful sex. 2. The harms of consensual sex are a unique issue for women. 3. Harm to women's senses of self. 4. Experiencing harm and the rationality of consent. 5. Why we as a society fail to recognize the harms of consensual sex. 6. How feminism has enabled the harms of consensual sex. And 7. A word of caution from Anthropology. In this lecture, we'll primarily be looking at Robin West's 1995 article, The Harms of Consensual Sex. West is the Frederick J. Haas Professor of Law and Philosophy at Georgetown. Her research focuses on gender issues and feminist legal theory, constitutional law and theory, jurisprudence, legal philosophy, and law and literature. A default position in discussions concerning the morality and legality of sexual behavior is that genuine consent that's given where all of the conditions for consent are met and none of the consent-destroying conditions are met, is both necessary and sufficient for the goodness, rightness, or acceptability of sex, such that if someone has consented, that sex is good, acceptable, and if someone hasn't consented, that sex is bad, unacceptable. The thought here seems to be that in cases of genuine consent about anything, not just sex, all parties are acting rationally such that they take the pros of what they're consenting to outweigh that thing's cons. However, even if it's true that genuine consent requires rationality, and rationality requires correctly engaging in a cost-benefit analysis concerning the thing in question, that doesn't yet mean that harm is eliminated from the situation. That is, someone could genuinely, rationally consent to an activity and nonetheless still be harmed by that activity. And this isn't saying that the harm is accidental. For example, I might consent to climbing a tree and accidentally fall out of the tree and hurt myself. In that case, the harm would be accidental. What this is saying is that it's possible to consent to something, have no accidents take place, and nonetheless still be harmed by that thing. It's plausible that in instances of consensual sex, harm still results for at least one party. In cases of harmful consensual sex, a person may consent to sex that they neither desire nor enjoy. Examples of why consent might occur in these cases: to stay in a partner's good graces, that is, to not get on a partner's bad side, to avoid an argument, to avoid frustration or unpleasantness in a house. For economic reasons, for example, the partner may end financial support if sex isn't forthcoming, or maybe other members of the family, like children, won't be supported as well if there isn't sex. Because of a believed duty to a partner, perhaps it's believed that sex is a requirement in a relationship, or that it's a duty of a person to have sex with their partner in a relationship. Because of a believed life role, this is somewhat different from a duty. Perhaps it's simply believed that it is one's lot in life, the role that one plays, what one is required to do in life to engage occasionally or often in sex that isn't desired and isn't pleasurable. Because of a belief that sex isn't or shouldn't be pleasurable, oftentimes there's a thought that if sex isn't pleasurable, well, that's just how sex is sometimes, or maybe that's just always how sex is. Perhaps especially women aren't supposed to have pleasure in sex or can't even have pleasurable sex. Out of fear of indirectly causing a violent outburst from a partner. Now, it's important to note here that if violence is threatened, if sex is withheld, and a person consents to sex, that's not genuine, legally, or morally acceptable consent, and that would be an instance of rape. However, in a situation like this, the thought might be if somebody doesn't have sex with somebody else, then that might make the other person angry down the road a ways. The anger isn't promised, it's not threatened, it's not necessary, but it is something that might show up later, and so people have sex in order to avoid that sort of violent outburst. Out of a need for protection from a partner. Maybe, for example, someone fears that they'll be hurt by some third party and they need someone who can protect them or take care of them, and they think that the way to get somebody to do that is to have sex with them, or maybe even there is some implicit or explicit thought that sex is part of a protective relationship with this person, so if you want them to protect you, sex is a necessary component of the relationship. Because of peer expectations, this happens especially when people are young. For example, everybody's doing it, or oh, you aren't having sex, or why aren't you and that person having sex? If people expect it, then maybe sex will be consented to, even if it's not desired and it's not pleasurable. Similarly, and this also happens with young people, although unfortunately with people of all ages, in order not to hurt a partner's pride, the partner might think there's something wrong with them, or that they're not good enough, or that other people will make fun of them if they aren't having sex, and so sex is consented to, even though that partner doesn't want the sex, doesn't find the sex enjoyable. Or in order to gain or retain some particular social standing, perhaps in order to get invited to particular social functions or be seen with a particular social group, somebody needs to be having sex with a member of that group, and so the sex, even though it's not desired, isn't pleasurable, is nonetheless consented to. And in all of these, we have cases of legitimate, legally acceptable, morally acceptable consent. There is some reason for consenting, but it's not as though there is coercion or incapacitation or ignorance of what sex is or some sort of fraud or misrepresentation. So this is all actual consent that nonetheless can result in harmful sex. While it's not the case that only women face the issue of consenting to sex they neither desire nor find pleasurable, and while it's also not the case that all women in all instances face the issue of consenting to sex that they neither desire nor find pleasurable, this issue is, by and large, one that affects women. The reasons why this issue is, in general, unique to women are multifarious, but most of them can be traced back to contingent historical and social circumstances that disadvantage women so that men can be advantaged, and that keep women submissive to men. In calling these contingent historical and social circumstances, what's meant is that these social and historical circumstances didn't have to happen. There's nothing necessary about these circumstances, but since they did in fact happen, these were the consequences of those circumstances. So recognize this. Traditionally, men have been the breadwinners, have been more sexually domineering, have seen sex in terms of conquest, and have manifested their sexual frustrations in terms of violence. Further, religious and cultural traditions have told women that they should serve men and submit to men, that they are weak and men are strong, that sex is painful and a punishment for ancient wrongdoing, and that their social position is entirely determined by the social position of the man that finds them appealing enough to keep them around. Given that all of this is true, women are uniquely disadvantaged by circumstances that would have them consenting to sex that they don't want or that they don't find pleasurable. Now, most would agree that to consent to sex and to have sex that one doesn't want and that one doesn't find pleasurable is, in itself, a harm. According to West, there is an even deeper and more long-lasting harm that comes along with consent of this sort. West says that accepting harm via consenting to sex strikes at the very core of a person's autonomy and personhood in a way that degrades that autonomy and personhood. This is not just an immediate harm in terms of losing what makes a person, but is also a long-term harm in that it makes it more likely that a person will consent to harmful sex in the future. Therefore, we have a feedback loop of harm via consent. Somebody consents to harmful sex. By consenting, they degrade their ability to see themselves as the sort of thing that doesn't consent to harmful sex, and so the next time they're more likely to consent to harmful sex, etc., etc. And these sorts of harms, these long-term, deep harms, occur in terms of damage to the ability for self-assertion, damage to the sense of self-possession, damage to the sense of autonomy, and damage to the sense of integrity. Let's look closer at all four of those. Says West, first, this is people who consent to harmful sex, may sustain injuries to their capacities for self-assertion, the psychic connection, so to speak, between pleasure, desire, motivation, and action is weakened or entirely severed. Acting on the basis of our own felt pleasures and pains is an important component of forging our own way in the world, of asserting ourselves. Consenting to unpleasurable sex, acting in spite of displeasure, threatens that means of self-assertion. Second, women who consent to undesired sex may injure their sense of self-possession. When we consent to undesired penetration of our physical bodies, we have, in a quite literal way, constituted ourselves as what I have elsewhere called giving selves, selves who cannot be violated because they have been defined as and define themselves as being for others. Our bodies, to that extent, no longer belong to ourselves. Third, when women consent to undesired and unpleasurable sex because of their felt or actual dependency upon a partner's affection or economic status, they injure their sense of autonomy. They have thereby neglected to take whatever steps would be requisite to achieving the self-sustenance necessary to their independence. And fourth, to the extent that these unpleasurable and undesired sexual acts are followed by contrary to fact claims that they enjoyed the whole thing, what might be called hedonic lies, women who engage in them do considerable damage to their sense of integrity. Many harms are directly experienced as harms. In fact, it's the experience itself that's the harmful part of many harms. Think of, for example, stubbing your toe for physical harm, or being told your work is no good for a harm that hits at your sense of self. However, there are other sorts of harms whose harmful properties might not be experienced because, among other reasons, 1. The magnitude of the harm isn't recognized. Perhaps something is recognized as harmful, but the full extent of the harm isn't recognized. 2. The harm extends across time in a way not able to be appreciated. You and I are very bad at anticipating and imagining how things will be in the future. If a harm lasts for a while, all we can recognize is how things are right now, how we remember they were in the past, and how we anticipate they'll be in the future. So we're often very bad at appreciating the full extent of a harm that extends across time. 3. The harm occurs in a way not actually experienced. Think, for example, if someone tells lies about you, or if someone is injuring someone that you think is important or that you love and you don't in fact find out about it. When this happens, you might think that you're being harmed. Now, even if you do find out about it, when you find out about it, finding out isn't the harm. Finding out is finding out that you have been harmed. And 4, the harm occurs in a way not possibly experienced. So maybe it's the case that you're harmed in a way that you don't experience, and that you either could find out later or you do find out later, but maybe it's the case that you're harmed in a way where you couldn't possibly find out that you were harmed. Imagine that somebody harms you in a way that you're not aware of, and then you die. Well, the fact that you died after the harm doesn't mean that you weren't harmed. So it seems as though it's possible to be harmed in a way where it's not possible for you to find out. For this reason, that we might not experience a harm as the full harm that it is, 1, we are not as aware of the existence or severity of the harms of consensual sex as we are of other types of harms. And 2, we can make insufficiently informed decisions about sex because we don't understand the possible harms. When we weigh the harms, we aren't weighing the full extent of the harms. Becoming inured through repeated harm to the self to the harms of consensual sex makes recognizing the existence of those harms less likely. This is a purely subjective feature of repeated harm, that it can feel less and less harmful, even if it isn't. Further, the self that would experience these harms as harmful becomes degraded because these are the sorts of harms that degrade the self. This is a purely objective feature of repeated harm. We might not even recognize that it's going on at all. Even a perfectly rational person performing a cost-benefit analysis on the harms and benefits of unwanted and unpleasurable consensual sex can only take into account the properties of harms that she can plausibly imagine in the moment of the cost-benefit analysis. However, since repeated harm itself causes further harm that can't be anticipated, it may even often be the case that from a purely rational cost-benefit perspective, in the long run, the harms of unwanted and unpleasurable consensual sex outweigh the benefits. Says West, this phenomenon, of course, renders the rationality of these transactions tremendously and even tragically misleading. Although these women may be making rational calculations in the context of the particular decision facing them, they are, by making those calculations, sustaining deeper and, to some degree, unfelt harms that undermine the very qualities that constitute the capacity for rationality being exercised. Thus, the sort of rationality that's required for consent becomes degraded by making rational, consensual decisions such that more and more consent becomes more and more broad and permissive and is given in more and more cases. In addition to the non-standard nature of the harms of consensual sex for the person being harmed, in that these harms don't feel the way that paradigm cases of harm like stubbing your toe or being insulted feel, there are also contingent historical and social factors that get in the way of our noticing these harms. First, we tend to incorrectly equate legality with morality, or to ignore morality entirely in favor of legality. Thus, we think that if something is legal, then there's nothing wrong with it. So, if the definition of acceptable sex in terms of the law is consensual sex, we think there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with that sex. Second, we have internalized what's known as the exchange theory of value, such that the only concept of value that we even understand is one in which all and only consensual activities result in value and result in an increase in value for every participant. Third, we are obsessed, at least in the United States and many Western democracies, with the ideology of liberal individualism to the point that it's nearly incomprehensible to us that a consensual activity, one that an individual rationally decided to engage in, could possibly be harmful to one of the participants. And fourth, we believe that men get pleasure from sex and that in consensual sex this pleasure is morally justifiable. Hence, we have to believe that no moral harm has been done in consensual sex. Now, we don't have to think these ways, but we do think these ways, which is why many of us will react to a claim that consensual sex can nonetheless be harmful or even morally bad with aversion or disdain or surprise. According to West, the theoretical projects and social goals of both what she calls liberal feminism and radical feminism act as enabling conditions for the harms of consensual sex. Now, we won't be able to define feminism here. It's too broad a set of positions and movements, but we can generally see what West is calling liberal feminism and radical feminism. Because these projects and goals act as enabling conditions for the harms of consensual sex, we become further blinded to the harms of consensual sex since feminists seem to be arguing for positions that not only don't recognize that consensual sex is harmful, but that actively enable that harm. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that West thinks that the essence of feminism itself is bad or wrong or misguided. In fact, she thinks that many of the most public goals of feminism are morally laudable. However, because of both inattention to conceptual nuances and pragmatic political choices, feminism, of both the liberal and radical sorts, has managed to obscure the facts concerning the harms of consensual sex. Thus, ironically, by fighting for equality, feminists have facilitated inequality. According to West, one of the central projects of what she calls liberal feminism in recent years has been broadening the legal definition of rape so as to be able to classify all non-consensual sex as rape. For example, in cases of spousal rape or when one person couldn't possibly consent due to incapacitation. However, in order to effect a change in the legal definition of rape to include all cases of non-consensual sex, liberal feminists had to, intentionally or not, depend heavily on a conceptual model of sex that tightly linked sexual badness with non-consensual sex. But just because something X is bad, that doesn't mean that non-X is good. And just because X is bad, that doesn't make X the only thing that's bad. However, because of the tight link between badness and non-consensual sex defended by liberal feminists, many people, maybe even most people, now see consent as not just necessary for morally and legally acceptable sex, but also sufficient for sexual goodness. That is, people can't see how consensual sex could possibly be harmful sex. Isn't consent the mark of the good when it comes to sex? According to West, one of the central claims of what she calls radical feminism in recent years has been the claim that most or even all heterosexual sex is rape, in which the woman is the victim. Thus, the goal of the radical feminist in this regard is to call into question the moral acceptability of heterosexual sex by equating that sex with rape. However, this radical feminist claim that most or even all heterosexual sex is rape undermines or even trivializes more liberal feminist projects that attempt to extend rape laws to non-consensual sex. The reasoning goes like this. If most or all heterosexual sex is rape, then either rape must not be as bad as we thought it was, or the concept of rape is morally and legally useless. But even further, if the thought's supposed to be that rape is bad because rape is non-consensual sex, a thought taken from liberal feminists, and if most or all heterosexual sex is supposed to be rape, according to radical feminists, then most or all heterosexual sex must be non-consensual. Thus, rather than claiming that rape is broader than conceived, as the liberal feminist is doing, the radical feminist is claiming that sex is narrower than conceived, which then reinforces the claim that all consensual sex is harmless. Now, it's important to note one more time here that West is not claiming that there's something essentially or intrinsically wrong or bad or misguided about feminism of the liberal or radical sort. Oftentimes, when we hear criticisms of feminism, the criticism goes something like this: feminism is bad, therefore anything that is related to feminism is bad. That's not what West is saying here. West, in fact, could legitimately be counted as a feminist. What's being said here is that certain decisions made by liberal and radical feminists in terms of concepts that will be used, argumentative strategies that will be employed, political choices to get pragmatic goals achieved that are made, have managed to reinforce the connection between consent and sexual goodness such that it's difficult for us as a society to see how it could be possible for consensual sex to be harmful. And a final word from West on the relation between feminism and making us blind to the harms of consensual sex. She says, liberal feminist rape reform efforts and radical feminist theory both, then, in different ways, undermine the effort to articulate the distinctive harms of consensual sex. The first, by indirectly celebrating the value of consensual sex, and the latter, by at least rhetorically denying the existence of the category at all. Both, then, in different ways, underscore the legitimation of consensual sex effectuated by non-feminist cultural and academic forces. My conclusion is simply that feminists could counter these trends in part by focusing attention on the harms caused women by consensual sexuality. Minimally, a thoroughgoing philosophical treatment of these issues might clear up some of the confusions on both sides of the rape-sex divide and on the many sides of what have now come to be called the intra-feminist sex wars, which continue to drain so much of our time and energy. And finally, a word of caution and advice from the discipline of anthropology. One thing that we should be careful of when looking at West's position and those in a similar vein is the combination of an implicit claim to be able to save the subjects of analysis and an explicit claim that those subjects are blind to their own need for saving. Anthropologists have long worried about analyzing the lives of those from very different cultures in terms of the dual positions that these people needed saving, and that unless they abandoned their ways of doing things and adopted the general ideology of the anthropologist, they would never even know that they needed saving. Instead, it was noted it might simply be that the anthropologist herself didn't yet fully understand the lives of the people she was studying. Now, this is just a note of caution, not a condemnation of what West is up to, not an argument against West. This isn't to say that West is wrong, that women are being harmed by consensual sex, and that they are generally unaware of this harm. What this is to say is that the strategy and style of arguments like West's have been used by people who were very wrong and who did serious damage to people's lives, and that therefore we should be careful and learn from the past mistakes of people who have employed this strategy. In this lecture, we've looked at 7 topics. 1. Consensual sex can nonetheless be harmful sex. 2. The harms of consensual sex are a unique issue for women. 3. Harm to women's senses of self. 4. Experiencing harm and the rationality of consent. 5. Why we as a society fail to recognize the harms of consensual sex. 6. How feminism has enabled the harms of consensual sex. And 7. A word of caution from Anthropology. Thank you.